It was a crisp September evening in 1960, the kind that lingers in the French countryside with the faint scent of lavender and sea salt drifting from the coast. Brigitte Bardot, the world's most photographed woman, had just turned 26. But in the dim light of her villa near La Garde-Freinet, far from the flashbulbs of Cannes, she reached for a bottle of sleeping pills. She swallowed them all. Then, with deliberate calm, she slit her wrists. Blood pooled on the tiled floor of her bathroom, a private sanctuary hidden behind locked doors where no director could script the scene. Paramedics arrived just in time, pumping her stomach in a hushed hospital room while the press speculated on exhaustion from her latest film. The truth? A unraveling that began years earlier, buried under layers of glamour and public adoration. I'm investigative journalist Elena Moreau, and for the past 2 years, I've sifted through faded letters, court documents, and interviews with those who knew her beyond the screen. What emerges isn't the sex symbol the world idolized: the pouty lips, the tousled hair, the bikini-clad icon who embodied liberation. No. It's a woman trapped in a cage of her own fame, where every smile for the camera masked a deeper isolation. Publicly she was freedom incarnate. Privately she paced closed rooms at night, wrestling with fears she rarely voiced. The terror of being consumed, of relationships that controlled her as much as she tried to control them. Flashback to 1949. Paris. A 15-year-old Brigitte, daughter of a strict industrialist and a homemaker, meets Roger Vadim, a film assistant 6 years her senior. Sparks fly during a screen test. Her parents forbid the romance. Defiant, she turns on the gas oven in their bourgeois apartment, lays her head inside. They find her unconscious, rush her to safety. It's her first brush with self-destruction, a quiet act in a family home where emotions were stifled behind formal manners. They relent, allowing the courtship but only marriage at 18. She weds Vadim in 1952, stepping into a world of scripts and spotlights. The public sees a fairy tale. Behind closed doors it's different. Vadim shapes her image, directs her in films that expose her body to the world. She complies but the control chafes. Nights in their small Paris flat, she stares at the ceiling, wondering if passion is just another role. By 1956, on the set of In God Created Woman, the facade cracks. She falls for co-star Jean-Louis Trintignant. Vadim knows. Accepts it even. I prefer her sense of adventure, he later says. They divorce amicably for the cameras. But in private, the transition is messy: late-night arguments in hotel rooms, whispered phone calls arranging secret meetings. Trintignant leaves his wife for her. They cohabitate for 2 years, a hidden domesticity away from prying eyes. She cooks simple meals, walks barefoot through Saint-Tropez streets, a habit that becomes her trademark, but one born from a need to feel grounded amid chaos. The world sees sensuality. She feels the weight of expectation, the unspoken fear that love is fleeting, that she's just a vessel for others' desires. Then 1959. Another whirlwind. Jacques Charrier, an actor. They marry hastily after she discovers she's pregnant. Publicly it's romantic. Privately terror sets in. In her villa, alone at night, she punches her stomach repeatedly, desperate to end it. Begs her doctor for morphine. A cancerous tumor, she later writes of the pregnancy in her memoir. She gives birth at home, shutters drawn against paparazzi camped outside. No hospital glamour. Just a midwife, dim lights, and her refusal to breastfeed. The baby, Nicholas, senses her agitation, cries incessantly. She's not made for this, she confides to a close friend over a late-night call. Motherhood feels like another prison. Charrier takes custody after their 1962 divorce. She sees her son sporadically, if at all. Years later, he's not invited to her weddings, she misses his. A decade passes without contact. Reconciliation comes late, tentative phone calls from her secluded estate, but the rift lingers, a silent scar. Fame amplifies everything. Power on screen, loss off it. Lovers come and go, over 100 by her count. Some betray her, exploit her naivety. In closed rooms, she endures beatings from partners who see her as a trophy, not a person. One, a musician, leaves bruises she hides under makeup for shoots. Another, a playboy, leaks stories to the tabloids after she ends it. She packs suitcases in the dead of night, fleeing to her Saint-Tropez retreat, La Madrigue, a fortress of white walls and gardens where strays wander in. There routines form. Early mornings feeding cats and dogs, afternoons writing letters to no one, evenings staring at the sea from her balcony. The public imagines parties. Reality? Solitude. Isolation creeps in, a fear she masks with defiance. 1966. Las Vegas. Marries Gunter Sachs, the German industrialist, after a courtship of helicopters dropping roses on her villa. Lavish. But within days an affair with a singer. Phone calls in hushed tones, arrangements made while Sachs sleeps. Divorce by 1969. The pattern repeats, passion ignites, control slips, isolation follows. Cut to 1973. She retires at 39. No more films. The world wonders why. In her villa, doors locked against intruders, she turns to animal strays she rescues, a menagerie that fills the void. But health falters. Breast cancer in 1983. She refuses chemotherapy, opts for radiation in secret. Nights in treatment rooms, alone with her thoughts. Fears of mortality unspoken, buried under activism. And then that call in 1992. From Bernard Diormail, a political advisor. They meet. Marry quickly. He urges her to reach out to Nicholas after years of silence. She dials the number, heart pounding. What will he say? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. The phone rings once, twice, a hollow echo through the receiver that seems to stretch across the decades of silence. Nicholas picks up. His voice, steady but laced with caution, breaks the quiet. Maman? It's a word she hasn't heard from him in years, not like this, raw, unguarded. They talk for an hour that first time, words tumbling out in fits and starts. She from her cluttered study in La Madrigue, surrounded by stacks of animal rights petitions and faded photos tucked into drawers. He from his home in Norway, where he's built a life far from the flash of her fame. Apologies mingle with anecdotes, the kind that skirt around the pain but hint at it. She tells him about the dogs she rescues, how they fill the house with life. He shares stories of his children, her grandchildren she's never met. But beneath the surface, unspoken fears simmer. Will this bridge hold, or crumble under the weight of old wounds? As the calls become routine every Tuesday evening, like clockwork the layers peel back. Brigitte confesses the nights she spent in the 1960s, locked in her bedroom after arguments with Charrier, chain-smoking Gaulois until dawn painted the windows pink. The public saw her as the epitome of French allure, gracing magazine covers with that effortless pout. But in those closed rooms she traced the scars on her wrists from that 1960 attempt, wondering if the emptiness would ever fill. Fame had given her power, the ability to command rooms, to sway directors with a glance, but it stripped away control. Relationships were scripted affairs, lovers chosen for their charisma, but always with an exit clause. She'd end them abruptly, over terse phone calls from pay phones in obscure villages, fleeing to isolation before vulnerability could take root. One such night in 1968, after Sachs's divorce papers arrived, she drove her Citroën through the winding roads of the Côte d'Azur, headlights cutting through the mist like accusations. The radio blared news of her latest scandal, a fabricated affair with a co-star. She pulled over at a cliffside overlook, engine idling, and stared into the abyss below where waves crashed against rocks. No one knew she was there, no bodyguards, no entourage. Just her, the salt air, and the temptation to floor the accelerator. Instead she turned back, arriving home to an empty villa where the only company was a stray cat meowing at the door. That became her habit, adopting animals as proxies for the connections she craved but couldn't sustain. By the 1970s, La Madrigue overflowed with them, dogs barking through the halls, goats in the garden, a menagerie that masked her solitude. Publicly she was retiring to find peace. Privately, it was a retreat from the gaze that had dissected her for 2 decades. Flash to 1986. Another unsettling event, buried in medical files I've unearthed. She's in a Paris clinic, curtains drawn against the autumn rain pattering on the windows. The diagnosis, breast cancer. She opts for radiation, sessions in sterile rooms where machines hum like distant thunder. No fanfare, no press release. Nights after treatments, back in her villa, she'd curl up in bed with herbal teas and notebooks, jotting down fears she shared with no one, not even close friends. The terror of mortality clashing with her image of eternal youth. Relationships by then were guarded. Diormail entered her life later, a stabilizing force, but even he navigated her moods carefully. Phone calls to him during those months were clipped, her voice steady but her hands trembling on the receiver. I'm fine, she'd say, but the isolation deepened, a contrast to the crowds that once mobbed her. Years roll on. Activism consumes her. In the 1990s, she chains herself to whaling ships in protests, her face weathered but fierce on newsreels. The world cheers the crusader. But behind it, routines of quiet desperation. Early mornings feeding seals at her foundation, afternoons dodging hate mail from those who saw her politics as extreme ties to far-right figures that alienated old allies. One evening in 2001, a visitor arrives unannounced, an ex-lover from the 70s now aged and bitter, demanding money for silence on their shared secrets. She meets him in the garden, under olive trees heavy with fruit, the air thick with unspoken regrets. He leaves empty-handed, but the encounter rattles her. That night, alone in her study, she burns old letters, flames licking the edges of memories she'd rather forget. By 2010, health falters again, hip replacements, falls in the bathroom that leave bruises hidden under long sleeves. Dear Mail cares for her, but tensions brew in closed-door arguments about her will, her animal's future. Phone calls to Nicholas grow more frequent, laced with urgency. She shares stories of her youth, the hidden pains, the abortion attempts, the beatings endured in silence. He listens, but questions linger in the pauses. Will forgiveness come fully? Or will the past pull them apart once more? Cut to 2020. The pandemic locks the world down, but for Brigitte, isolation is familiar territory. In her villa, now a sanctuary of creaking floors and animal companionship, she spends days wandering the rooms, touching mementos from a life half-lived in shadows. A package arrives one afternoon, photos from Nicholas of his family. She studies them by lamplight, tears unspoken. Then a decision forms. She picks up the phone, dials a number she's avoided for years, her doctor's. I need to talk about the pain, she says, voice steady but frail. What follows? What follows is a series of appointments, shadowed by the creeping inevitability of age. The doctor, a discreet practitioner in nearby Saint-Tropez, listens as she describes the aches, not just the physical ones from old injuries and surgeries, but the deeper pains that no scan can capture. Arthritis in her hips, remnants of those falls in the villa's slick-tiled bathrooms where she'd slip while tending to her cats, feeding them before dawn. But more than that, the emotional toll, the isolation that had become her armor, now cracking under the weight of years. She speaks haltingly over herbal tea in his office, windows fogged from the Mediterranean rain, admitting fears she'd long buried, the dread of dependency, of losing the fierce independence that defined her. Prescriptions for painkillers follow, but she takes them sparingly, preferring walks along the beach at La Madrigue, where the sand grounds her, even as her steps slow. In those pandemic months, the villa transforms into a fortress of routines. Mornings begin with the chorus of animals, dogs yapping for breakfast, goats bleating in the garden enclosure she'd built herself decades ago. She moves through the rooms with purpose, sorting stacks of correspondence from supporters and critics alike. Phone calls with Dear Mail punctuate the afternoon's conversations, laced with affection but edged with the strains of caregiving. He's there, steadfast, handling the foundation's logistics while she dictates letters to politicians, her voice still carrying that commanding timbre over the line. But nights bring the quiet unrest. She'd sit on the balcony wrapped in a shawl against the chill, staring at the dark sea, replaying decisions that shaped her hidden world. The abortions attempted in secrecy, the relationships that promised freedom but delivered control, the son she distanced herself from out of fear she'd fail him as her parents had her. Reconciliation with Nicholas deepens gradually, like a tide inching in. By 2021, video calls replace phone ones. She sees her grandchildren's faces pixelated on the screen, their laughter a balm against the solitude. One Christmas he visits La Madrigue for the first time in years. The reunion unfolds in the living room, amid the clutter of animal beds and framed protest posters. They share meals of simple Provençal fare, olives, cheese, bread she bakes herself in an old oven. Words unspoken for decades surface. Her regrets over the custody battles, his understanding forged in therapy and time. No dramatic embraces for the cameras that aren't there. Just quiet acknowledgments in the golden afternoon light filtering through shutters. Yet tensions linger, old habits of withdrawal. She'd excuse herself to feed the strays, leaving him to wander the gardens, pondering the mother behind the myth. Activism remains her anchor, even as health wanes. In 2022, she launches a campaign against factory farming, her foundation coordinating from the villa's converted stable office. Late-night strategy sessions via email, her fingers stiff on the keyboard, railing against the cruelty she'd witnessed on undercover visits years before. One unsettling incident, a death threat, arrives in the mail, postmarked from Paris, accusing her of extremism due to her political affiliations. She reads it alone in her study, lamplight casting shadows on walls lined with books on animal ethics. Dear Mail urges security, but she waves it off, locking doors tighter, her fear manifesting in increased vigilance, checking windows before bed, a habit from paparazzi-plagued days. By 2023, mobility declines. A hip fracture from a stumble in the garden sends her to a private clinic, curtains drawn against curious eyes. Recovery is slow, spent in bed with stacks of reports on seal hunts and bullfights. Visitors are rare. A few loyal friends, activists who share coffee in the sunroom, discussing strategies while cats curl at her feet. The public sees occasional statements, fiery missives on social media managed by her team, but privately, vulnerability creeps in. Phone calls to Nicholas Grow confessional. She shares stories of her 1950s affairs, the beatings endured in silence, the fame that isolated her like a gilded cage. He responds with empathy, bridging gaps with tales of his own life, but questions hang. Why the distance? Why the animals over family? 2024 brings quieter battles. Cancer returns, a shadow from the 80s, treated with targeted therapy in discreet sessions. Nights after, she'd lie awake, the villa's silence broken only by animal stirrings, pondering legacy. What of the power she'd wielded on screen, now channeled into saving lives with 4 legs? Relationships, too, reflect. Diormail's devotion contrasts her past volatility, but even he navigates her moods carefully, arguments flaring over foundation funds and closed-door evenings. As 2025 unfolds, frailty intensifies. Routines simplify, mornings in bed with tea, afternoons dictating memoirs or pleas for adoptions. Her final social media post, hours before the end, urges rescue for shelter dogs, a testament to unwavering commitment. On December 28, in the familiar confines of La Madrague, surrounded by her menagerie and Diormail, she slips away peacefully at 91. No scandals, no spectacles, just a quiet exit from a life of contrasts. The icon who bared her body to the world, yet guarded her soul fiercely. The animals mourn in their way, the sea whispers on. Her foundation endures, a living echo of the hidden battles she fought. But in those final moments, did peace finally find her? The letters she left, sealed in drawers, might hold the answer. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.